Hi everyone, this is Darius from Self-Archeology.com. Today I am talking with a man who some of you may already know. He worked for 10 years as a therapist. He's a filmmaker, writer, and musician. He's my colleague, truth seeker, and friend, Daniel Mackler. Welcome, Daniel.
Hi, Darius. Nice to talk.
Likewise, Daniel. Now, in your work, you talk a lot about self-knowledge, childhood trauma, healing, and personal growth. I myself find these topics completely fascinating and I have spent a lot of time doing self work. But why do you think it's important and useful for a person to dedicate a good amount of time to self knowledge, personal history, introspection, and things like that?
Well, I think if a person doesn't dedicate a lot of time to that, basically they're living on autopilot. They're not becoming more conscious, and then therefore they're not really growing. And if they're not really growing, I don't really see them as meeting their mandate for life. And for me personally, if I'm not growing and becoming more aware, I don't really see the purpose in living. Then it's kind of more like just flatlining instead and living for comfort. So for me, life is an exploration. And if I'm not doing self-knowledge, then I'm not exploring basically the most important thing in my world, which is my inner world. And that's my conduit to understand the outside world. So for me to understand the world, I have to understand myself first.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm curious, how did your own personal self archaeological journey started? Or to put it differently, how were you able to retain the rationality and curiosity that we do have as children, but so many of us are forced to lose or repress? Could you talk a little bit about your childhood and your interest in truth and self knowledge?
Sure. I think, well, I remember when I was a kid, I always explored. I had a lot of pride in that even, and people often told me that I was exceptionally curious. People pointed that out often, that that was one of my more noticeable qualities, that I was very curious. But I wasn't extremely curious about my inner world. That was a territory that was a little too scary for me when I was a kid, even pretty much as a teenager. It wasn't until I was a late teenager that I started becoming more actively curious about my inner world. But as a child, I was very interested in studying nature and fishing and hunting and doing taxidermy and collecting rocks and minerals and having a butterfly collection, of doing sports and athletics, exploring what I could do with my body in the world, basically exploring dating, exploring drinking alcohol, trying to do really well in school, learning math. I read a huge amount, and so I was very much an expanding person as a teenager, uh, but it was not so much inwardly directed. That transition pretty much came. I see that the defining point for me was when I was about 20 years old and I started really looking within much more consciously. I was writing in my journal starting when I was 17, but it was very scary and I wasn't very good at it. It was very, actually very difficult. I was weak in that area. But when I was 20, it started much more strongly. And I think what happened is I started becoming a more independent adult. I started breaking away from my parents much more. I started doing things on my own, far away from home. And somehow being out in the world away from my family, I just suddenly had the space to really have a very strong relationship with myself. It was a new relationship because I'd never had it so powerfully before, where it was very clear that this relationship, that these thoughts going through my head and my feelings were a relationship between me and me. I'd never had that before. And so once I realized that, and it came powerfully when I was 20, it was 21 years ago, actually. I just started doing inner work. It just happened. I didn't even know that that's what it was. I knew that I suddenly had an incredibly powerful relationship with myself, but I didn't use any of the terms we're using now because I didn't have any terms for it. I just knew that something powerful was happening inside of me, and it just kept growing and growing and growing, and it's just become more intense over the years. And also my relationship with myself has become more powerful, more dedicated, more caring, more more self-respecting. And then also by extension, I've just become a better, stronger person in the world. I think my morals have become stronger. My sense of caring for others has become stronger. Um, my sense of strength as a person with an internal force has become stronger. Um, My understanding of human psychology has become stronger. My understanding of my own strengths and weaknesses has become stronger. My understanding of my childhood and what happened to me has become stronger. My understanding of my parents has become stronger. My parents being like who they are, what they did to me, what happened to them, why they are the way that they are. Also just understanding why I was pretty much throughout my whole life, the strengths and the weaknesses. Like I wasn't necessarily the most positive person at all when I was a teenager. I had a lot of rage and anger and sadness and hurt and jealousy. I still have some of those qualities, just definitely much, much less now at age 41. But I really think the profound thing that changed my life was becoming independent from my parents and doing a lot of inner work. And both have led to the other. So breaking away from my parents has given me a lot more strength and determination to become a better, healthier person through self-knowledge. And then doing all this inner work, to use your word, self-archeology, has also propelled me forward into more independence, not just from my parents, but internally from the parents that they put inside of me, and breaking from those lies.
And it has been established and consistently proven that the most important factors for a person's mental health or health in general are their early childhood experiences, environment, and the bond with their caregivers. Could you elaborate on why and how are these things fundamental for one's health and development?
Sure. I think it's like, I'm going to say an analogy. If you're making pancakes, that's like saying the quality of your pancakes is going to depend on the ingredients you put into it and the way that it was cooked. So so for me, like a human being, okay, we start off with a genetic template for being human, but what forms us is our early childhood experiences, and that basically is the parents that we had, and because they form our early society, our early culture, and they form the ingredients that help give us the chance to become who we are. And so it's, I guess to me, it's just a given. It's like almost not even worth exploring or discussing, because it's so, I guess at this point to me, it's just so completely obvious that our childhoods absolutely are the number one profound thing that affect who we are. And and I would go so far, even to go further, not just our childhoods, but our childhood relationships with our parents. And of course, other things play in, like the society we grow up in, our economic status, our race, the time period we grow up in, the food that we eat, our education. But really, it's primarily our parents, and everything else comes after that. But I don't know. I mean, yes, I mean, some people, of course, are profoundly affected by their genetics if they have some sort of genetic disorder or some other thing that affects their life, but I don't know what else it would be that so profoundly affects someone's life, even remotely as close to the effects of their childhood. I mean, yes, I know people who say things happened in their adulthood that profoundly affected them, traumas or wonderful things that happened. But to me, all those things that happen in adulthood are still observed and experienced by us as individuals through the lens of our childhood experience.
And these facts are not new and they are well established. However, it's still hard for people, even in the 21st century, to accept it. People like Alice Miller, Lloyd Moss, and others have documented the consequences and history of childhood trauma in great detail.
Yeah.
Of course, we all were children once. Our mind and body remembers what we have experienced, and we see dysfunction all around us. So why do you think so many people are still in denial about their personal history, the mental state of the general society, and the long history of child abuse?
And I think it's just terribly painful to know the truth. I think there's so many excuses for why we can avoid it that it's just a horrendous, overwhelming pain, basically for everybody. I mean, I haven't shared this publicly, but I didn't even tell you, Darius, but I actually spent a day with Alice Miller's son in Switzerland a few months ago, month and a half ago, maybe 2 months ago,
And
and
how was it?
it was really interesting. He and I had a long conversation about his mom. I mean, he's coming out with her biography soon, but the basic point that he makes, and he's written about it, before, and he's been given interviews about it. But what was very interesting was that his mother was someone who understood the theory, pretty well, not perfectly, but pretty well understood the theory of, child abuse and the effect of childhood trauma on adults and how people pass that on. But what was pretty clear is that she really didn't get it for herself. She basically largely had not explored her own childhood and was not public about it, and really was very closed in, and still basically to the end of her life an extremely traumatized child living in an adult body. And this has been my thesis that I've written about her. But what was interesting is hearing it from her son, who was saying it from the perspective of having grown up with her as his parent, and also to have known her till the end of her life, and to know that this was someone. So even though she was one of the best people in the world to understand what it means about childhood trauma and the effects of it and the consequences of it, and even to some degree how to resolve it, even she, so when even she didn't get it for herself. She largely just didn't get it, and acted out her traumas, and really was a victim of them for her whole life. She was actually, like her first book was sometimes subtitled or titled, She Was a Prisoner of Her Own Childhood. And so the reason I bring it back to, I saying that, I'm going to bring it back to your question, is how do people so profoundly in our world still deny it in the 21st century? And you said when people like Alice Miller and Lloyd Demouse have gone so far to explain this so publicly, it's like even one of those two people you mentioned herself didn't get it. So I think it makes it more understandable why the average person who doesn't even understand the theory can't get it. Because if they can't even get the theory, how can they apply it to themselves when one of the people who's created the theory doesn't even know how to apply it to themselves? So I think it's a tough challenge, and it's on a continuum. It's people can get their childhood problems and understand how to work through them to some degree, but it's like on a continuum. I think a lot of people get it to some degree, more and more nowadays, but then it's like, how far do they go on the spectrum of really getting it and really working this stuff out?
Yeah.
And I'd say for me, it's like, I've never said, I mean, actually, early on, when I was 20, I thought, oh my God, I'm enlightened. I figured it out. I got it. And there was something profound that I'd gotten some level of theory about something, but that as I've gotten older, I've become more humble to realize I'm only some of the way on this path, and that I still have a lot more work yet to do. I've got a good grip on what's going on inside of me. I have a very strong understanding of the theory. It's just to apply it to oneself is a heck of a challenge. It's very difficult because it's so painful. There's so much grief involved. There's so much ancient loneliness and neediness that comes up, and also it's very hard to do it without a lot of peers. And it's in a lot of ways it's a lonely journey in this very troubled, traumatized, isolating, disturbed world.
Yeah, I can sympathize with a lot of things you've said. And I think now is a great time to talk about definitions. In today's society, it is at least somewhat accepted that strong beating, sexual abuse, and things like that are abusive. But when you and me, say child abuse or childhood trauma, we are talking not only about beating, sexual abuse, or even yelling. It involves much more than that. Child abuse or abuse in general is a very delicate concept. So, what is your presumably objective definition and understanding of child abuse and childhood trauma?
I'll do my best. I think I've defined it on my website as anything that um, anything that invades or hurts the spirit of a child is child abuse. And so now, what is the spirit of the child? Their essence of who they are, their actual developing self, that boundary around their self, when that gets invaded or hurt or punctured in any way, that's abusing the child, that self of that child. So all those things you described, sexual abuse, I mean, to sexually molest a child, to rape a child, to introduce inappropriate sexuality in some way into a child's life, that of course very clearly abuses the spirit of the child. Anything that harms the body of a child, like some adult doing this to a child, is abusing that child's spirit as well as their body. So it's like underneath the body, the sexuality, is that more fundamental self. And so when that self gets hurt, that is abuse. So also yelling, what does yelling do? Yelling is very disruptive to a child's inner world. When parents yell, when parents fight with each other, when parents yell at their child. So it's a more general definition, and it's a little bit harder to quantify it. That's why I think people in our modern world pretty much like very strictly defined quantifiable things. Like, for instance, to have sex with a child if you are an adult is a very clearly, easily defined thing that everyone can grip onto and say that's abuse. To punch a child in the face when you're an adult, that's very clearly an abuse of this less powerful creature, and it's abuse of that child's body. But when you get into like neglecting a child, not giving them something that they deserve, which is parental love when you're their parent, being inconsistent, or parents emotionally betraying the child, it's like that's much harder to quantify, especially in very specific terms. And I think that it's especially hard for people who don't have a strong connection with their own inner selves, especially in a strong way, to understand what anyone's self even is. So it can sound like a very nebulous thing, and it probably doesn't make sense to most people if they don't have a really strong connection with themselves to go along with my, as you use the word, objective definition of child abuse. But to me, it's still very clear. It's like when that child suffers, who's putting the child in a position to allow the child to suffer? Who has created this child to come into a world where it has to experience suffering? It's like the person who has done that is failing at their responsibility to protect that child from suffering. They're not doing an optimal job of nurturing that child to have a connection with him or herself and to grow. And so that person, to me, is abusing the child. And that's again, the definition can seem to be a little vague to understand it in practical terms. It can also, people could view me as very, very harsh because I see every parent as abusive. It's like, find me a parent who isn't to some degree abusive, meaning a parent who hasn't to some degree hurt the spirit of their child, violated the spirit of their child. And yet that is a definition that I use because I see it as an objective definition. It's just a question of, do other people agree with me? Mostly not, but on the other hand, why would they? Most people don't even realize nearly to what degree they've been abused and to what degree they remain traumatized.
And could you give some examples of more subtle child abuse or trauma? Stuff that is not so visible and clear to average people.
Sure, a child who has two parents who don't really love each other. That's abusive to that child. What kind of role modeling are they presenting? What kind of environment is that child being brought up in when they have two parents who aren't really loving and respecting each other? That child's growing up in a world where the two primary figures in his or her life are not respecting each other fully and are not fully bonded with the purpose of raising this child properly. And that child picks up all the hurt that's going on. Or another simple one, parents who haven't worked out all their traumas. Those parents are going through life still looking for love, looking for nurturance, looking for other people to rescue them. And inevitably, they're looking for people who are dependent on them to give them that love, and who easier to look to than their own child. So that child, at some subtle level, is picking up the messages that his parent is still traumatized, that is still is a traumatized child, is still a needy child, is still looking for external love to meet his or her internal needs, and is looking to that child to rescue the adult. And that's a violation of that child's spirit, because that child did not come into the world to love the parent. And our world is so screwed up that parents go around saying, oh my God, you've got to have children. You'll never experience love like this until you have a child. That is straight up abuse. And it's abuse of the child, abuse of their spirit, abuse of their purpose on this earth. Because the child has a very clear purpose when he's born or she's born, to learn, to grow, to receive love, and to get love from the people who created him or her. And so when those people don't do that, and don't do it fully and optimally, meaning they're a little bit screwed up in some ways, then they're abusing that child. They're abusing their responsibility. And that child is being traumatized by this and the reason I say they're being traumatized is because when that child experiences that abuse, doesn't get his or her needs met by the people who are primarily responsible to do it, that child suffers. That child has overwhelming feelings, and those overwhelming feelings are not processable. They're getting in the way of his or her growth. They're getting in the way of his or her knowledge about himself. And so because he can't resolve those feelings, he has to split them off because they're so painful. And when he splits them off, then he's dissociating, and that's the hallmark of trauma. It's just something that's too overwhelming to deal with, too overwhelming to talk about. And when we're talking about children that are pre-verbal, they can't even talk about it. So they're putting it somewhere else, they're getting traumatized, and gets locked inside of them, and it actually creates the fundamentals of their developing personality. So that's why our world is so screwed up, because so many children have this fundamental part of their personality based on trauma from very early life. And it's not just sexual or physical abuse. And that's why it's so confusing for some people, because they're like, I didn't experience any physical abuse, I didn't experience any sexual abuse, but I still relate to all this trauma stuff. And why is that? I feel a little guilty. Like, my parents were not so bad, my world was pretty good, I didn't get abused in any obvious way. And it's like, what they don't realize is they were actually severely abused. It just didn't conform to traditional, conventional societal definitions of abuse. They actually were severely abused, and they're severely traumatized. They just don't know it. And they also feel guilty because they're not getting any support in the world, because they still need to believe that myth that their parents were awesome parents, when the truth is their parents were actually extremely negligent and abusive and failed pretty miserably. That's the category that I fall into to varying degrees. I mean, a lot of people could hear me talk about my abuse history and they could say, oh, he's pretty extreme on the abuse history. But if they hear the details from another angle, they could say, wow, I don't even get it. It doesn't sound like he was abused at all. And the reality is like, that I was. It's just that most people don't really have a good, strong sense of what abuse is. And they don't have a strong sense of their own abuse history. They don't know who they are very much on the inside. So they really don't relate to me very well. And they don't actually relate to their own real self very well. And they don't relate to children very well.
Yeah.
And often they don't even know any of this, and which is why they so uncomfortably and blithely go along having children, because they think they're actually going to do a pretty good job at it. And when their child starts flipping out and gets upset and gets angry and has tantrums and breakdowns, they do what everyone else in society pretty much does and says, well, that's just normal. The truth is, it may be actually normal, but it's still abusive, because the norm is so absolutely fucked up.
Yeah, it's sad and painfully common. Now, I would like to talk about your movies.
Sure.
In your documentaries, you focus on mental health problems called schizophrenia and psychosis. As a
Yeah.
therapist, you also have worked with people who have such problems.
Yeah.
And there's this big nature versus nurture debate. But would you say that even such severe conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder are pretty much symptoms of one's traumatic experiences?
Yes.
Is it genetics?
No.
What's your take on this whole nature versus nurture debate?
Yes to nature, no to nurture. I mean, sorry, other way around. Sorry, I got it wrong.
Yeah, I got you.
No to nature, yes to nurture. I mean, anyone has the capacity to lose their mind. And I mean, I don't believe that this thing called schizophrenia is actually a thing. It's not a definable thing. It's just a conglomeration of so-called medical symptoms that get a label called schizophrenia, or something that gets a label as so-called bipolar. But those words to me don't specifically mean anything. What I think, it's much more reasonable to say someone is in an extreme state, and what caused this extreme state? Tons and tons of upwelling, unresolved trauma from very early life that's been triggered by something in the modern life. And things like lifestyle definitely contribute to it, but the basic thing that causes it is extreme unresolved childhood trauma. And the things that get labeled as schizophrenia, in my experience from observing a lot of people and knowing a lot of people who've had that label, and intimately knowing them and hearing their experiences and walking with them through their lives, is that it's really extreme stuff that causes that. It's not mild stuff. And so it's like a lot of like really super horrendous stuff. I mean, now, could I lose my mind, go absolutely nuts, and end up with that label of schizophrenia? I think yes, it would be possible, but I think it would have to be pretty extreme adult stuff to cause that. I think with people who have much more extreme childhood trauma, it can be much milder things that set it off in adulthood. And but the idea of it being biological, I mean, that's just a farce. They're always looking for excuses for what it's going to be. Oh, it's genetics, but find me some real genetic proof. Even the geneticists, they're always saying, well, we think we've almost got it, but they never get it. And it always makes the headlines. Well, we think we know what it is. We haven't defined it 100%, but we think this kind of gene turns it on and off, and it's always a bunch of silliness, and it's very distorted science from all I've read. And then when they get into the twin studies, and the really good identical twin studies, it's like there's really not that kind of concordance, especially it's like the twin studies are really very flawed. So it's like anyone who wants to read about the real good nature versus nurture stuff, I would suggest for reading about the nature stuff, look up the work of J. Joseph. He's a psychologist in Oakland, California. He's written some of the best books on debunking all this genetic myth for so-called mental illness. Brilliant guy, great books, really insightful, really gets the genetics well, and it's like, it's very helpful. Though to me, I've read the stuff, but for me, I figured that out long ago anyways. It's like, I didn't need to get into all the genetics to understand that this is a bunch of crap. It's like, it's extremely traumatized people who are having upwelling traumas in adulthood, and that gets labeled with all these funky names like schizophrenia and bipolar and schizoaffective and psychosis and all that.
Yeah, and also many mental health professionals say that if one is diagnosed with schizophrenia or psychosis, they have to take medication for the rest of their lives, and they will be sick for the rest of their lives. Could you tell us a little bit about what positive effects you have documented in your movies, and
Sure.
why so many mental health professionals are pretty much wrong?
Well, to answer the first part, or the second part, why are they so wrong, is when they say you need to take medications and you're going to have this disorder for the rest of your life, what it really means is they have absolutely no clue what else to do. They have no idea how to help people resolve their traumas. They don't understand really what's going on at all. And all they know how to do is give people pills that dope them up and make them into zombies so that they're more manageable. They're easier for society to deal with. They're easier for therapists to deal with. And they buy into all this genetic stuff, because then they don't have to get into all the traumas and what this stuff really means. And how convenient for people who are therapists who have never really dealt with much of their own traumas. They can't, and because it's also very, very stressful to be around with people who are having tons of upwelling traumas, because it triggers one's own traumas. So it's for people who haven't dealt with a lot of their own inner world, it can be very threatening to work with people who are in these extremely altered, extreme states that get labeled schizophrenia, bipolar, mania, psychosis, things like that. So the other part of your question is what have I documented or made my movies around is, well, first is my experience as a therapist, watching people in extreme states come out of it sometimes without the pills. And more often than not, do people really come out of it when they're on the pills? Sometimes people seem to get their minds back a little bit, but then they become pill dependent. And getting off the pills is extremely, extremely hellish for a lot of people, if not for some people, just downright, given their circumstances, impossible. They just have it's just too difficult for a lot of people. Not necessarily impossible for anyone given certain environmental circumstances, but very, very difficult. So what have I documented? Well, I made this film called Open Dialogue about the Open Dialogue project in Finland, which right now statistically is getting the best results in the world for helping people who are in first episode psychosis, the stuff that if it goes on for a few months, gets labeled as schizophrenia. They do intensive family therapy, helping people work out what's going on in their relationships with their family members. They meet with them very, very early on in their problems. They don't wait 1 or 2 years until the person's becoming like so embedded with their problem that they've gotten super stuck. They're getting people pretty much at the beginning when their first psychotic stuff is flaring up. And super intensive family therapy, meeting with them every day, not putting them in the hospital, if at all possible, not putting them on pills. I think it's like something like 2 out of 3 people never got on any antipsychotics at all. Another big thing they do is try to help them regulate their sleep-wake cycles. So a lot of people who are going through all this extreme trauma are in overwhelming anxiety and they don't sleep well. Duh, it's kind of obvious because they're so overwhelmed and anxious. And then what happens is if they don't sleep well, or if they don't sleep at all for 2, 3, 4, 5 days, or a week, or 2 weeks, then anybody's going to go nuts. So whatever problems they're already going through are just totally amplified by lack of sleep. So a lot of people, once they help them sleep, and sometimes they do it with sleeping pills, which they give short term, but basically it's like get that person to sleep quick, give them sleeping pills for 2 or 3 days. You can get people who have really lost their minds profoundly and are really out there with just a couple of days of sleep. They can really come back to themselves. They don't need antipsychotics. And then if they've been given sleeping pills like benzos, like Valium and stuff like that, short term, for just a few days, they don't get addicted to it because these drugs are extremely addictive. And when people start taking those for months or years, it's like absolute hell to get off those benzos. if they give them very short term, it's not difficult to get off the drugs. They get off of them, and often that can be enough to start getting them back into sleep at night, be awake during the day, sleep at night, being awake during the day. And then for some people, that can be enough to yank them out of their psychotic state and give them enough insight to be able to work through whatever they're going whatever they're going through interactionally. But then it's another thing is to help them see what is it that they've been going through in their lives. What is it going on in their social networks and with their family members that's been going on to elicit all this stuff in them. And a lot of times for a lot of people, that's enough to help people pull through and basically to work through whatever it is they're going through and not to be so-called psychotic anymore. And that's where their results right now are something like 85% of people with first episode psychosis in this whole catchment area of northern Finland are pulling through their psychosis. That's one example. And then, but they're a place that part of what makes them special is not just the work that they do, but the fact that they're quantifying it with actual data. A lot of other places that I visit get very good results, some perhaps even better than this place, this open dialogue place in northern Finland, but they just don't sit around quantifying their results as specifically according to like DSM diagnostic criteria. So, but there's a lot of places that get good results. And also, when I travel, I constantly am meeting people who have been labeled with schizophrenia, who have never taken meds or who have gotten off their meds and who are not psychotic at all anymore and really have a grip on what happened to them, why this happened to them, and have made sense of their lives. And those people are all over the place. And then when I travel and screen my films, like last week I was in Massachusetts for a week, I met many people who were diagnosed with extreme stuff, who aren't on meds, who are living, it could sound rude, some people don't like the word, but living very functional lives, basically. Doing what they do, going to school, working, not out there, not in extreme states, and have understood why whatever happened to them happened and didn't get into I need to take my medication for life, I am schizophrenic, I am bipolar. They didn't buy into that medical model mishmash that I actually find to be very sad and incorrect.
In your last movie called Coming Off Psych Drugs and in your other movies, you talk about the harm of drugs. So, how serious is the drug situation in today's society, and what are the consequences of that?
Of psych drugs in
Yeah,
specific? Um,
or
well,
of drugs in general.
I'll try psych drugs first. That the obvious thing that turns most people against psych drugs is a lot of them have horrible side effects. I mean, all of them have side effects. It's just that not everyone gets affected by the side effects the same way. But it's like, people's, let's say antipsychotics in specific, lifespan becomes much shorter. It's like, I think the average person with the same diagnosis, if two people are diagnosed with schizophrenia, one takes the psych drugs, one doesn't, on average, the person who takes the psych drugs has a 25-year less life expectancy. They cause brain shrinkage, they cause all sorts of physical effects in the body, long-term causes, they cause things like dementia, a lot of people get diabetes on them, Parkinsonian problems, tardive dyskinesia, oh God, kidney problems, liver problems, it's like, you name it. Sexual impotence, heart disease, massive weight gain in a lot of people. I've known people who've, lost their eyesight because of these drugs. And those are the mild ones. Here's the extreme ones. All the people who have committed suicide on them. They just got on the drugs and just something happened inside of them that it just like literally was the causative factor. The straw that broke the camel's back and they committed suicide. But all the other ones are extreme also. So that's something that's pretty obvious. A lot of people who, especially if you know a lot of people who take the psych drugs, you'll hear tons of side effects and also feeling like a zombie, can't pay attention, can't read anymore, can't focus, can't think straight, just want to sleep all the time, loss of motivation. I mean, these are the things that I hear about all the time, get emailed all the time. Or then there's another thing, people get on the drugs, becoming violent, full of rage, becoming more psychotic, becoming loss of all their relationships, loss of interest in interacting, an inability to have conversations, blah, 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 blah. So those are all, and then, toxicity of the blood, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, with a serotonin-oriented drug, serotonin syndrome. I mean, and I've heard, by the way, all these things I just described, in the last week of doing film screenings, I heard all of these. That's just in 1 week, and I've been doing this for years. So it's like constant stories about these horrors. But I think on a deeper level, the real issue I have with drugs is that they send a person a message that you can't do it yourself. You need a drug to do it. You need something outside of you to save you. And so the deeper message is whatever it is that's inside of you can't help you. And so it's like the message is you can't solve your own problems. You can't do this inner work, to use your term. You can't do the self-archeology. You can't gather that self-knowledge. You can't figure it out. You can't work through your problems. You need this external helper. And you need it long term. You need to be dependent on this because there's something wrong with your brain. And that's the message when people take a long-term drug or a drug that's antipsychotic. They need something to undo it because they don't have the resources within themselves. And my experience is that's a horrible message. That's a lie. Well, first of all, it's just not true. But second, because people can do it themselves, and they can do it with the help of other people and interactionally and through internal work. But what a terrible message to send someone. It's an absolutely cruel and hopeless message that someone can't do it themselves. So in a bizarre way, sometimes for some people, I think that they've actually had a lot of benefit by having nasty side effects from the drugs. Because if people didn't have the side effects, they'd say, well, this drug makes me feel good. It's helping me, so I'm going to just keep taking it. They're still going to be getting that message, that terrible message that they can't do it themselves and they can't solve their own problem and they need this external pill. But they're not, and so they're going to keep taking it. Whereas if they get a horrible side effect, there's going to be some wake-up call. Oh my God, I'm taking poison. And so thank God for many people for the side effects, because then they're like, I don't want to take this drug. And then they have to start looking for alternatives. And one of the alternatives for many people is, oh my God, I need to do inner work. I need to take responsibility for myself. I need to figure out who I am and what's going on inside of me. So that's specifically my answer to the psych drugs. But I think that's true for a lot of drugs in general. Why do people take drugs in general, including alcohol and other drugs? They're looking for something outside them to make themselves feel differently because they're not comfortable with their feelings. I could feel a little hypocritical saying this because sometimes I do some of those drugs now because, I don't know, I guess you could say I'm exploring life. Sometimes I smoke cigarettes. Sometimes I drink alcohol. Sometimes I try other things. And so psych drugs, no. On the other hand, I did get prescribed Valium because I'm doing a lot of overseas flying, and often I'll have to do a speaking engagement the next day in a 6-hour different time zone. And it's like, if I don't sleep in the airplane, it's horrendous for me because I don't sleep. I'm 6'4", or whatever that is, 195 in terms of centimeters. That, you know, my knees are right up against the seat in front of me. I'm all uncomfortable. If I don't sleep, it's horrible. So I sometimes have taken a Valium. I've done it a couple of times for overseas flights, and I found that, wow, I can sleep. And it totally helps with my jet lag. Could I do that internally? Could I get to such a point where I could meditate and calm myself down and relax and sleep? Occasionally it's happened, but a lot of times it doesn't happen, especially if I have someone in front of me who's moving their seat back and forth. But I don't know. In general, it's like, in general, I like being pretty clean. I don't like taking regular medications or drugs of any kind, and I like focusing on my internal world to work out my deeper problems. And I think for that reason, I think I've become very strong and don't really see breakdown or a breakdown as being in my future. Though, of course, if some horribly traumatic thing happened to me, I got stuck in a prison and I got beaten and raped all the time, I could see myself losing my mind. I could see myself really struggling to keep my connection with myself, but I could see it as possible that some ancient traumas inside of me would upwell. I could become overwhelmed. I could dissociate and go into some altered state just to protect myself, you know, really split myself off into a deep side of myself. But at this point, I don't see that happening in my life unless something really extreme happened.
Now, let's talk about healing in general. In
Okay.
your experience and observation, what are the best or required factors, environments, or helpful tools that might help a person to heal their inner wounds?
Hmm. Wow, that's complicated. Um, I think the first thing is the person just has to have the motivation to do it. They have to have some internal motivation to do the work. Because I think there's a lot of people who have a lot of opportunity, all the external stuff is correct, and they just don't do it. So the first thing is that ingredient is something, some spark has to happen within a person that says, oh my God, I want to look inside. Now, of course, I think it's easier to look inside if people are more independent from their parents, if they have a sense of freedom, if they have a sense of, I don't know, their own self-worth, if they tend to be less traumatized. I think it's easier to do more self-work. Um, I think it helps if people have people who really believe in them around them. So I think people often who are more skilled, who are more talented, who are, I don't know, generally more loved, more intelligent. I think a lot of these things help because the world is giving someone a lot of positive feedback, a lot of positive mirroring. So it's easier to see one's gifted self if the world is mirroring back a lot of positivity. And I think some people, when they're getting mirrored back a lot of that positivity, are more likely to just wake up and realize, oh my God. But I think it also can be a combination of fucked up things happening. It's like my family, at a very crucial time in my life, in my early 20s, right around when I was waking up, my parents were going through horrible conflicts, and then they divorced when I was 21 and split up, and it was extremely ugly, and my dad having affairs and my mom being an alcoholic, and it's just like chaos happened at a very profound transitional time in my life that just made me realize, oh my God, the example that these people, my parents, have set for me for my adulthood, the path that I was supposed to follow, the footsteps that I was supposed to follow are wrong. These people have totally fucked up their lives. And oh my God, I have to try something different. So I really stepped away from my parents and started really searching within myself. I also think something that made it easier for me was that it started to work. I noticed it. Right away, I started to notice benefits from doing this inner work. I started making better decisions for myself. I started having better relationships with women, you know, women being people who I was romantically interested in. I started having better relationships with my friends. I started finding new friends. I started having more courage to go out in the world and try different things. I started trusting myself more than trusting books. I started really listening to an inner voice inside of myself, and I realized that inner voice was actually loud and had good instincts. And I started following what that little inner voice said and realizing, oh my God, I actually know what the hell I'm talking about. I gained a lot of confidence very early on, and I started really following my own path and my own mission, and realizing just with the evidence that, oh my God, what I'm doing is working. And having that repeated hundreds and thousands of times, I became very confident in what I was doing. What else helped? A lot of things. I mean, 10 years of no drugs, no alcohol, no cigarettes, that really was a chance to be just with me. And all the things I talked about before, I didn't do it all for 10 years. The whole time I was a therapist. I did a lot of dream analysis, really studying what the hell was going on inside my unconscious when I was sleeping, because I had a good ability to remember my dreams. I did tons of that analyzing, a huge amount of journaling to really strengthen my relationship with myself and to really explore my motives and explore my behaviors. Celibacy, I did that for 10 years, didn't have any relationships with women romantically, or very, very minimal. Maybe the first couple of years I was exploring it, but then maybe 7, 8 years of just nothing, no kissing anybody, no holding hands, no dating. 2 years without masturbating, really just exploring that whole active sexual side of my life, just totally not doing that, and getting to know who I am and what are my sexual feelings and what do they mean, and to really explore myself in a sexual way with very few variables, because not even masturbating or dating was definitely an extreme way to explore myself. Being very careful of who I spent my time around, spending my time only with friends who had really, really good boundaries, so that I really learned what it was like to be very well respected by the people I spent my time with. Also, my work was work as a therapist. So I was spending all of my days, basically all of my energy, just focused on healing. In this case, it was other people's healing. So I really got to watch other people do their healing process, some better and some worse, but to really observe a broad swath of humanity, because I really worked with a very broad variety of people. I think it helped that I traveled a lot. Before I was a therapist, I traveled a huge amount all over the world, hitchhiking and backpacking and just doing wild stuff, going to strange foreign countries and living there, learning a lot of other languages. And then after being a therapist, I've been doing that for the last 3 years. So I've really gotten a great chance to explore the world. I think that really helps for people to see what other people are like, what other cultures are like, how other people live their lives, but at the same time to realize that at a fundamental level, we're all the same. And for me, that is so confirmed now. My inner world definitely applies to other people. It's like humans are really not that different at a fundamental level. Yes, culture makes it seem like we're pretty different, but we all need the same things. We want the same things. So basically, really realizing the universality of my experience has been very, very helpful. Also, staying very far away from my family has been very helpful because they're not triggering all those ancient early traumas that they inflicted on me. So staying away from my parents, it's given me a real chance to explore my childhood without them getting their fingers in the middle of it, because at a lot of levels, my parents are very extremely unsupportive of me exploring my childhood traumas because it doesn't make them feel good and it doesn't make them look good. Also, what are my childhood traumas that they inflicted on me? They're just a replication of the things that my grandparents did to my parents. My parents, in a very minimal way, have dealt with the traumas of their own childhood. So by me dealing with my traumas closely around them, it's triggering all their unresolved traumas, which both my parents have been pretty largely committed to not exploring. So basically, they were very unhealthy people for me to be around. I needed to get the hell away from them. So as a universal thing, I think it's generally very, very helpful for people when they're doing deep healing work to get the hell away from their parents so they can explore their traumas in a safe, protected environment where they're not being sabotaged by people. Even though parents, a lot of times, they try to be helpful, a lot of times, even whether they want to or not, they're not very helpful. So this isn't to say my parents are the evilest people in the world. They're not. But it's been very important for me to get away from them. And I think for a lot of people, it's very important to get away from their parents. On the other hand, I very much can be supportive of people who want to go back to their parents and explore more about their parents and explore their relationship. Anyone who feels the motivation to go back to their parents and they want to try it, they're not going to get any trouble from me because I'd say go back and try it. I've done it many times. Go back and see what it's like. And then I often, and actually every time, have realized again, more often than not, the last like 10 years, I've realized very quickly, okay, I realized I had the urge to go back to them, and very quickly I realized, bad call, get the hell away. Or maybe I went in for a specific reason to get some specific information that I wanted or something, some bit of knowledge that I felt that they could give me or some bit of knowledge that the interaction with them would give me. And I've gotten that. A lot of times it's been very painful. Some ugly, horrible stuff has happened to me in the last 10, 15 years with my parents in terms of very painful emotional rejections. But even that has been very helpful for me to understand who these people really are, who I really am, what my unconscious needs really have been. And so it's given me a chance to really grow a lot. So, and then, I don't know, just putting a lot of energy into living a very healthy lifestyle. And all that has been extremely useful in terms of me growing. And I think that from what I've seen with others, this is also pretty universal. People who do a lot of things to really further their own self-growth, to work on their own internal traumas and to try to resolve them, to do a lot of grieving and healing, those are the things that help people move forward in life. And so, I guess in a nutshell, that's kind of what it is.
Now, to my experience and observation, sadly, it's very hard for people to get real help and support from others. And you've mentioned this also, like a
Yeah,
lot of therapists, counselors, gurus, and other helpers are extremely dysfunctional and
yeah,
psychologically primitive people. And the problem is that often people who seek help don't have a rational methodology how to evaluate their methods.
right,
So often they are encouraged to repress their unpleasant emotions, dissociate, erase themselves, or buy
right,
products or services that don't work or do harm.
yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what is bad, false help, and what constitutes true useful help, and what to look for in a person who is your quote-unquote helper, and what to avoid?
Right, right. I'll try to keep this simple because I feel like I've got about 10 more minutes.
Yeah,
So basically, I think most therapists suck, and I don't recommend them. And the main reason I think most therapists suck is because they haven't done a lot of their inner work. And so no matter how good their techniques are, people who haven't done a lot of inner work can't help other people all that much. You can't help someone much more than you've helped yourself.
yeah,
And so the main tool that a therapist offers is they're actually themselves, their true self, and their own life experience. And so when people don't have a lot of their true self, aka they're still pretty traumatized and they're still pretty shut down and repressed, that's actually pretty much what they're offering. They're offering some percentage of themselves and a large percentage of their own unresolved stuff. And they're actually without even realizing, they're offering other people techniques for following their example, for keeping a lot of stuff split off. So what is a good therapist? A good therapist is someone first who is a very healed person, who's done a lot of their own inner work and has a lot of experience of working through trauma. And it doesn't even necessarily mean they have a lot of experience helping other people do it, because that's secondary. The most important thing is that they have experience helping themselves. So there are therapists that have been therapists for 40 years, are well respected, they've got the PhD, they've got all the credentials and all the licensing, and they can teach at universities. But if they don't have a lot of experience healing themselves, I don't care if they've done 25 or 50,000 hours of therapy, they can still be horrible therapists. But if you get someone who's brand new, who has a lot of deep interconnection with himself, has had a lot of experience of working through their own trauma and healing and growing, then that person could be a fantastic therapist.
Yeah.
And I've seen a couple people like that. And I think for myself, when I started, I felt ready to become a therapist because I knew I'd done a huge amount of my inner work. I was 27 by then. I already had 7 years of extreme self-therapy and self-work as personal experience. And when I became a therapist, I felt I was really good to begin with. And a lot of my clients who were much older than me right away realized, this guy can actually help me. We don't give a shit how old you are. They said, a lot of them said that. But there were also a lot of people who were very afraid to go into their inner world. They were terrified of their traumas coming up. And then they looked at me, and what an easy excuse. Here's a 27-year-old guy who looks like he's 18. How could I possibly trust him? He's not even a full licensed therapist yet.
Mm-hmm.
I had people who were more mature who somehow intuitively realized that I had a grasp on a lot of this trauma stuff, and they trusted me and they hung in there. So I lost a lot of clients right up until quitting my therapy when I was 38, who were still firing me because they thought I was too young, even after 10 years of experience. I thought that was kind of ironic.
Mm-hmm.
But I think also a lot of people don't have a very good ability to assess the quality of their therapist because they don't have a strong connection with their inner self. All they know is they're in a lot of pain. They're really suffering, but they don't have a connection with the deeper inner self behind that. So they're just looking for someone to help them resolve their pain. And so they can get a bullshitting therapist who has a lot of techniques, who has a nice office, who looks the part, who has gray in their beard and gray hair, and says, yes, okay, I have a lot of experience with this. And it seems very believable. And they say, yes, I can help you work through this. And half the time, those are the therapists that at some point say, well, I realize your condition actually has much more of a biological component than I previously realized. So I think it probably would help if you got a psychiatric evaluation. It seems like you've got some sort of biological depression or maybe a little bit of bipolar, and then they send them to a psychiatrist because really they can't handle the person's trauma. So how do you find a good therapist? You have to first have some sort of good connection with yourself. Then I'd say ask them a shitload of questions and really try to find out how healed they are and figure it out. And if the therapist doesn't want to get into revealing how healed they are, then there's someone who's not worthy of trust. That's the only thing I could think of. If I was going to go to a therapist, now, which by the way I have no interest in because I feel like I can be my own therapist, but if I was going to go to one, I would really want to find out how healthy they are. And if I didn't have the tools to figure it out, I would want to gain the tools to figure out how healthy is this therapist. The problem is, people who are not very connected with themselves have a very difficult time assessing the actual healthiness of other people. It's easy to get faked out a lot when you're pretty dissociated. That's the unfortunate thing. So it's a hard thing.
Yeah.
And I wish I had an easy answer. Though a lot of the people who email me and have questions, well, is my therapist good? How do you assess it? A lot of times my gut reaction is the fact that you're asking me, some random person who you trust, so many questions about your therapist suggests that your therapist probably isn't that good. Maybe it's wrong in some cases, but most of the time I'd say when people really don't trust their therapist so much, probably their therapist sucks. On the other hand, it's complicated because I've had a lot of people not trust me, and I think actually I was good, and they were just scared of dealing with their shit. So it was a convenient defense for them to not trust me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I can very strongly relate to your experience, so it makes sense to me. And my next question is somewhat related to the last one. What would be your advice to a person who wants to work in the mental health field or help people in general?
Do your own homework first. Heal yourself as much as you can. Do your own inner work. Work through your pain, work through your traumas, and before you begin, literally work through as much as possible. Because that is going to be what's going to make you a good therapist. Not school, not training. Simple, there.
Yeah. And my final topic, everybody who is interested in healing and growing knows that doing this is socially challenging since the society as a whole is so unhealthy. And often a lot of resistance sadly comes from one's family. And as we already mentioned, dealing with your family when you are trying to heal and grow can be very challenging and stressful. Sometimes this may lead to a healthy decision to modify your personal boundaries, to limit the time you spend with them, to take a break from the relationship, or to leave it for good. So I know that you are writing a new book about how to deal with your family in situations like this more effectively. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I have 2 minutes because the person I'm
Yeah.
staying with right now is about to vacuum. So I got the 2 minute warning.
Yeah.
So to talk about my book, well, actually, I've addressed a lot of the subjects of my book in this interview. I was actually impressed with how good of an interviewer you were. So thank you, Darius.
Yeah, no
Um,
problem.
that basically it's a book saying it's a valuable thing to break up with one's parents because it gives you the space to be able to do your own inner work and to do your own healing. I talk about a fair amount about my own experience with breaking up with my parents. I use a lot of anecdotes from stories I have heard. I basically anonymize everyone. I disguise people's identities and disguise situations so people wouldn't even recognize themselves. A lot of it's my own stories and life experiences that I've disguised. And I just talk as much as I can about the whole subject of people breaking up with their parents, why it's valuable, how difficult it is, how painful it is, what it means, where to get support, how tough it is, how parents react. I talk about confronting parents, how difficult that is, the value in it. I talk about people's relationship with their siblings and how difficult that can be. I talk about healing, I talk about growth, I talk about psychotherapy. So basically, I talk about a lot of the different subjects that we've talked about in this interview. I just go into a lot more detail, basically.
Yeah, I want to respect your time, so we can end it here. I just want to thank you for your time and your insights, and it was very enjoyable and thought stimulating for me. And could you tell us where can people find your books, your movies, your videos, your music, all the good stuff?
Wildtruth.net. Wildtruth.net. It's all there. My movies are now in tons of different languages and in Lithuanian because you translated 3 of my movies into Lithuanian. So you can see there's the subtitled section of the DVDs. You can find all the different languages. When my book comes out, which hopefully won't be too long, maybe a couple more months, it'll be available on my website. The other books I've written are on my website. Lots of my essays are on my website. And hopefully at some point more stuff is going to be on my website. So I better run.
Yeah, great. I'll put the links below. And thanks again for the interview. And hopefully we can do this again sometime in the future.
Great, Darius. Have a
Yeah.
good one. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.